Good morning, everyone. Today I wanted to walk you through Psalm 65 using both the English text and the Hebrew text and point out a few very fascinating characteristics of this psalm, which is a psalm of thanksgiving. Also a little more cheerful than some of the things that we've already been dealing with. We're moving now into some of the other genres a little bit, and the Song of Thanksgiving here is one of them. So we'll do a typical reading with the time, location, characters, and objects idea from the text world theory perspective. In order to do this well, I would like you to download the PDF of Psalm 65 that I've made for you from the Hebrew text, and also to have a copy then of the English text as well, because of course, unless you're pretty fancy with Hebrew, it's not necessary to try to even translate any of this on the Hebrew page at all, but just really to get a feel for what the Hebrew text looks like after your professor's gone after it a little bit here. So the first thing I wanted to point out to you is that Psalm 65, like about probably 30 or 40% of the Psalms, is actually numbered differently in the Hebrew than it is in the English. And because of this, if you look at the Hebrew text, you're going to be one number off. So the number that we would have for verse 1 is actually in the Hebrew verse 2, and so forth. So the Hebrew text of this one has the superscription numbered with number 1. You'll see that at the top. It's highlighted in pink, okay, with a little notation that says Hebrew numbers. So when you go to read a commentary, for example, if you're reading the word commentary, oftentimes they've used the Hebrew numbering rather than the English numbering to describe what's going on in that psalm, because it's a technical commentary and sometimes might have a head-scratching moment. So just to be aware of that fact, that if the numbers seem to be 1 or 2 off, it's because of the difference in the Hebrew versus the English numbering. So according to my analysis, and also the way it's laid out in the New International Version, this psalm divides up really well into 3 sections. Okay, so in the English it would be verses 1 through 4, verses 5 through 8, and verses 9 through 13. And then, of course, in the Hebrew, it would be 2 through 5, 6 through 9, and 10 through 14. So as we're talking here, and I'm pointing at the Hebrew, again, notice that you're a little bit offset from what's going on in the English. So I went through this Hebrew text and actually formed it into kola, separating the parts of lines, pretty much according to how the accent marks in the Hebrew would indicate that they would be broken up. And I was looking for some examples of parallelism that would actually show up in the English as they do in the Hebrew. And I think I found at least one good set. So we'll talk about that after a little bit. But laying it out this way, I thought it was very interesting to kind of look at the different characteristics of what's going on. Now, we remember from lament psalms that there's always at least 3 characters: God, the psalmist, and then the enemies. This is a Thanksgiving psalm, and for a refreshing change in this one, we don't have any enemies. So in looking for characters are marked out in green. I've chosen to circle the word Elohim, and there's an English translation right underneath it, and it's in the second line down. Okay, so we have a direct mention of God, but it's God mentioned as Elohim. So in an English Bible, it would be translated G-O-D, little o and little d, rather than Lord, which is L-O-R-D in small caps for Yahweh. So this is one where God is referred to as Elohim. Now, I've also circled a few other things there, and you can see the similarities there almost all the way down. We have some suffixes that are attached there. Now, there's a couple of different kinds of suffixes, but they look similar in the Hebrew. So the circled item right at the beginning of verse 2, which is far to the right, remembering we're reading right to left in Hebrew, is the kaf kamates suffix, which is a masculine singular. So there we have the to you, Lord, Elohim, to you, Lord. And it comes out in English in the same word order, fortunately. So we're accenting the fact that we're addressing, or the psalmist is addressing God here. And you see there's repetition there in the second line as well, and kind of similar sort of shape of the words. And so we have again, and to you, Lord. So in the English here, we have praise awaits you, our God in Zion. To you, our vows will be fulfilled. You who answer prayer, to you, all people will come. And those are nice parallel lines. In the English, they come out very similar word order wise to what the Hebrew has. Normal English would be, our vows to you will be fulfilled, but this is very poetic, and I'm glad to see that our translation has brought this poetic nature forward. If you go down a little farther, we have another set of suffixes that actually the last three before the orange line occur all at the end of the line, which would give a similar sound at the end of each of these three lines. And these are not object suffixes. They're not to you, our vows, or to you, all people, but rather it's a sort of list of possessive suffixes. So you notice that it's shaped the same, but it's doing something different. And here we have this list, your courts, your house, your holy temple. And I thought that was really very, very nice kind of triplet there. And we see that here starting at verse 4. Blessed are those you choose and bring near to live in your courts. We are filled with the good things of your house, of your holy temple. So these come to be fairly synonymous with one another, but again, there's a movement going on here. Your courts, the courts of the Lord would be outside the temple. Your house, perhaps moving into the part of the temple that priests could go into, but your holy temple would be the holiest of the holies where only priests could go. So in the sense of temple location, we can pretty much claim that we have a spatial aspect to this here that is doing that sociological thing that we talked about in the forum post this week, which is when society has a space that's designated, that space not only will be designated, but it also helps form the people who use the space. So it's a very recursive idea. Now, the one thing I missed at the top was the word right after Elohim that gives us a good spatial clue here, and sort of starts the whole psalm off with us in one space with the psalmist, because he's talking about Beit Zion, in Zion. Okay, so we are in our mind brought to Zion, which is a synonym for Jerusalem. And so therefore, when we get talking about the courts, the house, the holy temple, we definitely have a social setting to that is brought into view for us. And we've noticed that in the Psalms, sometimes this is not there. There's oftentimes not a specific place, but here there's mention of this place. And so we've got place, time kind of narrowed down to a time when the courts and the house of God and the holy temple were standing. Notice, because of all of these suffixes, all of these things are tied to God. The vows are tied to God. The people are coming to see God, and all of these objects, the courts, house, and holy temple, all belong to God. So all the way through these first verses here, 1 through 4, the orientation is acknowledging who God is and where God is residing. Now, the holy temple in the next section gives way to a God who's associated with hope to the ends of the earth, to the farthest seas. So our spatial range has just gone farther. Okay, so using the point in Zion as a sort of focal point, we can then see that the psalmist is now looking outward to, as far as he can imagine, all the ends of the earth, the farthest seas, the mountains, and mentioning the seas again. And here we begin to see that for the psalmist in this particular setting, the idea of water is becoming to be something that's very important. Not only the seas, but then the water that comes up in the next section here. So the third section, after the whole earth, we also have a mention of the morning and the evening. And that is, I highlighted that in red, looking at those as sort of objects, but actually morning and evening are a time margin, so they should be marked a little bit differently. I wanted you to notice here how nicely the two words that are important are tucked into the middle of that phrase. Okay, so we have boker for morning, evening, they're tucked right next to each other. So it's forming a little chiasm within that one line. Now, interestingly, these words are the same terms that are used in the book of Genesis, and there was evening and there was morning. But we can see here the terms are reversed. So the word pair is a very common word pair in the Hebrew, but not presented as a direct sort of allusion to Genesis. But the pair is somewhat evocative of the idea of Genesis. So we might have to reach a little too far to say it's actually associated with it. And then we get to the idea there of always. Okay, so there's an all times idea, morning, evening, all the time, and every place. Okay, so then shifting over at the third section, starting at English 9 through 13, Hebrew 10 through 14, something else is being added, and we go back to having a lot of green marking. It's marking the second person Elohim again. So you can see the term Elohim in the Hebrew of verse 10, which is the Hebrew of verse 9 in English. Okay, and a statement: you care for the land and water, you enrich it abundantly. So the psalmist is giving credit to God as being the one who cares for the earth and provides water for the earth. And living in an arid environment like that, the source of water and having water was very important. It's at the end of that line that something significant is said as well, because we have the idea, the streams of God are filled with water to provide the people with grain, for so you have ordained it. Okay, so now we're getting kind of to technical terms here. The psalmist is acknowledging in a technical way that God had a right to do this, and then indeed it was up to God to have caused it to happen in the first place. So you'll see again another series of circled bits of Hebrew there. The ones that appear at the front of words are actually a suffix that goes prior to the verb and indicates second person. And then some more of those kaf kamates that we had before. Up at the top of the psalm, again, some more suffixes going on, second person being indicated again. Now, the final section here has a lot to do with description of what happens when God waters the earth. And I love the language in here. You drench its furrows and level its ridges. You soften it with showers and bless its crops. You crown the year with your bounty. There's another time frame, and we can then see that perhaps this does have a setting in the temple when there's an actual harvest festival, because this language here has a lot to do with bringing the harvest in, and therefore another sort of festival that can go on. The final two verses, even in the English, I think are just wonderful. The grasslands of the wilderness overflow. The hills are clothed with gladness. We're getting the idea. Kind of a little personification creeping in there. Hills don't normally wear clothing, but the word for clothed sort of brings us partway into that idea. The meadows are covered with flocks, and the valleys are mantled with grain. So we have this idea of fullness being brought out here. And in almost a more generic term, we've lost all of our second person suffixes and prefixes in that last verse, 13 and 14, both don't have the personal address there, but it's sufficient to say it's carrying on the idea that had been brought in before. After the valleys are mantled with grain, they shout for joy and sing. And here we have a really lovely personification of what you might see if you were traveling through the Palouse, say, for example, right before the harvest, and you see all that wheat just out there blowing in the wind, and this idea that the creation actually has movement lends itself to being personified with the idea of shouting for joy. Now, the idea of nature making noise has already been addressed in Psalm 19, and that's this is another reprise of that idea that nature has a certain type of voice. So looking around in this for finding some good parallelism, I've looked at it for a little bit, not for a really long time, but noticing at verse 6 in the Hebrew, which would be 7 in the English. Actually, let's see, what have I got here? Yeah, verse 6 in the Hebrew, 5 in the English. You answer us with awesome and righteous deeds, God our Savior, and the hope of all the ends of the earth and of the farthest seas. And now we have a list in English, verse 6, who formed the mountains by your power, having armed yourself with strength, who stilled the roaring seas, the roaring of their waves, and the turmoil of the nations. Here we have an indented section in the Hebrew text that I was wanting to show you there. If you look at the very far indent of the second line of 6 and then 7 and then 8, you'll see they all begin with the same letter, right? And some of those words in there are what you would call a hymnic participle. They tell you what God does. A participle is an ing word in English, or it can be translated as the one who does something. So here we have the idea of God is the one who formed the mountains by your power. He's the one who can make, and that kind of thing. So we've got a nice sort of consonants there with the 3 repetitions. It's actually a sound. And so that works there and kind of continues on. But then notice that verse 8, all of a sudden we lose the mem on the second part of that line, and the next part matches up with the part that's farther in on line 8. Both of those begin with something that looks like a little crown. It's a sheen, sha'un, yamayim, and then sha'un, and then the rest of that line. And so how that plays out in verse 8, we have, who stilled the roaring of the seas, the roaring of the waves, the turmoil of the nations. Okay, so we've got what you could call a stair-step parallelism there, because it's repeating the verb without actually mentioning it. And so it kind of comes off as a stair-step with the repetition of the next word in that particular line. So there's some really interesting things in the Hebrew, some compelling things. Nothing in here that I would say is a classic parallelism per se, but there's a lot of repetition of sound. And you can see the poetic nature of this because I've sorted it into kola, into short parts of the longer line, and you can see that they're rather short. So if you went and did likewise with your English text, for example, actually it does happen pretty well in the English that I'm looking at, which is an NIV, where the lines are shortened and put in indents and so forth. So those are just a few of the text world characteristics of Psalm 65. I hope you'll read kind of with this in mind, keeping in mind how many times, for example, in this psalm, the psalmist mentions God by personal pronoun, to you, for you. He mentions him by name, Elohim, twice. And so forth and so on, but no enemies in a really nice kind of way. Even the seas and the water are being portrayed in more of a friendly nature. Now, at verse 5 in the Hebrew and at verse, let's see where we are here, 5 in the Hebrew, 4 in the English, we have the word, again, blessed are those you choose and bring near to live in your courts. And in the Hebrew, this is the word esrei, the same word that we found in Psalm 1, esrei, happy is the man. So in a way, it's interesting that in the NIV, I believe, let me take a look back at Psalm 1, they also translate Psalm 1 as blessed. But in some of the translations, they're going to translate that as happy, because it's not the root word baruch, which means God blessing something in a formal way in Hebrew. But again, we do have that phrase, a beatitude type phrase. Blessed are those you choose and bring near to live in your courts. This psalmist really liked being in the temple. He really liked to be kind of hanging around with everybody and being in worship, and especially at this time of real thankfulness to God, probably the end of a harvest season. It's a time for great rejoicing. So similar to what we do Thanksgiving in the United States or other kinds of harvest festivals that occur around the world, it's a time to recognize that the hard work of the farming is over, and it's time to now enjoy some of those benefits. The psalmist, frankly, puts everything in God's lap. The blessing, the water, everything is provided by God. So we can see here a real sense of faithfulness on the part of the psalmist, that this is God's work, that God has taken care of them. And it would take not too long to decide that this would be those acts of God that could be remembered in the harder times. I remember when this happened. This is how God provided. So these are all some things about Psalm 65. I'll be curious to hear if you all have some more points to make about it. And I will look forward to also reading your work this week, and I will talk to you soon. Bye now.